Hi, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach, and we're going to be chatting today about the process of selecting an opportunity. This particular topic is dramatically more complex, obviously, than what we're going to be able to cover in this relatively short video presentation. Um, but the core thing to keep in mind is that for many entrepreneurs, the selection of opportunity is driven entirely by something that they want to accomplish, right? So something along the lines of, I needed something and I couldn't find it, so I figured I would build that or provide it, and then other people will buy it too. And it's a nice starting point in some ways because it's obviously very closely connected to the entrepreneur. So, the entrepreneur feels very strongly about it, but it has a potentially major flaw, which is that inherently the entrepreneur has picked an opportunity that has a market of precisely one customer themselves. Now, it is possible that other people and organizations also want to buy something similar, but that's an assumption. And so in this conversation, we're going to be approaching this with the perspective that the book Disciplined Entrepreneurship brings in the early steps, which has to do with narrowing down to a market segment that makes sense. That's the approach that we're going to take. I'm going to walk through this relatively quickly. And I'll try to provide some context and some thoughts as we go along as well. So let me get this started by sharing this deck and getting that going, and we'll see what we can do here. Okay, so the way we're approaching this is by talking about this from the perspective of focusing sort of a funnel of ideas to try to find a specific market segment that really makes sense. And the idea behind this is pretty much, what we've just been saying, which is that, there's no shortage of things out there that you could try to do, but some are better than others. And one of the key things that we want to think about is specifically which markets and market segments are going to be the most conducive towards an entrepreneurial opportunity. One way to think about this is you could choose a really, really difficult market to serve or a very difficult market segment to try to access. But all you're doing is making things harder. So I bring no judgment to that. If you want to go after an opportunity that's going to be really, really hard, that's totally up to you, and I admire it and even encourage it. But be aware of it, right? So, from the perspective of disciplined entrepreneurship, the idea is to specifically try to choose something that makes sense. As an entrepreneur, you always have the option to choose something that might be much more difficult. So the way that this is laid out is sort of with four components: segmenting the market, doing primary research, choosing a beachhead market, which we'll sort of explain in a moment, and then calculating TAM. And so the idea of total addressable market, the different forms of market size are covered in much more detail in the book. We're just going to kind of make sure that we're sort of on the right page here with some of this stuff. So the reality, which sometimes seems incredible, is that a business to survive and ultimately to be profitable has to have paying customers. And this is true for any kind of organization. We could be talking about a for-profit company. We could be talking about a nonprofit company. We can even be talking about a government organization, which gets its funding from its customer, usually either a state or federal legislature, and by extension, the taxpayers. So what we're trying to get past here is a couple of myths about getting started, which many entrepreneurs bring to the table. One is that you can sell to everyone, and so your market is, absolutely everybody. And the second one is that given that we can't sell to everybody, that what we can do to figure out, how big the opportunity is just kind of generate a fake number around how much market penetration we're likely to get. And so in hundreds and hundreds of business plans and pitches that I've read, entrepreneurs will say things like, oh, we only need to get 5% of this market to be profitable or to hit our targets. Or our estimates are very conservative and we're only targeting 1% of the market. And the question you should really be asking is, well, where did that number come from? I mean, if your idea is so good, shouldn't it be 90%? If it's you're really using estimates of only 1%. Aren't you kind of saying that what you're doing isn't really very attractive to most customers? So what we're really trying to encourage is being very granular about this, right? Getting very specific about market segments, and then really digging in to get some primary data. And I appreciate that in the world that we live in with endless internet access and now Gen AI, it can seem like all we need to do is run a couple Gen AI searches and we can figure out how big a market is or where the customers are. And the reality is that for those of us who are really engaged in the space, whether in founding companies or funding companies or serving as executives on companies and advising companies, we really, really want to see entrepreneurs get out there and talk to potential customers, talk to people in the space, because the data you get on the internet is just what the internet believes. And some of it might be right, maybe all of it's right. But the truth of the matter is that you're much better off knowing from some direct interactions. And so we really want to talk about some primary research. The idea behind a target segment is that you have a group of people or organizations, potential buyers, that we can treat in roughly the same way. That is, if we offer something, we think we can offer it to the entire segment. Now, the book approaches this from sort of three connected factors: that they buy similar products, they have a similar sales cycle and think about value in a similar way, and they use word of mouth to interact with each other. And I'm fine with this, and it's good to be aware of, in the context of the course, and obviously, for quizzes and book from the book's perspective. I personally like to think about market segments just slightly differently. Here's the way I think about it. It's closely related, but just a different rephrasing maybe, which is that if you have potential buyers and when they are presented with the same value proposition, they make the same purchase decision, then they are in the same segment, right? And the reason that I like to approach it this way is because ultimately this is about behavior, right? That's what we're shooting for. We're shooting for targeting potential customers who behave in the same way. If you can, and show them what you offer and it fits their criteria and they're educatable, and you've done the selling process in a reasonable way, then they should make the same decision, right? If they're in the same segment, they should make the same decision. And that's just a slightly different perspective. We love to think about market segments from a behavioral perspective rather than from just things like, are they roughly the same age or, from the same nation or something like that. As we're pondering how different applications could then target a segment, the idea here is that we're trying to focus down to something that we think will work, right? And so there's a variety of factors that we can take into consideration. Book talks about 8 of them: funding, access, having a compelling reason. I like to call that having a pants on fire need. If someone's pants are on fire, they will pay a lot for a fire extinguisher, right? So that's sort of a compelling reason perspective. A whole product or a solution. Can you work around competition? Is there leverage to get to other market segments? Is this aligned with what the founders are really trying to do? And we certainly see no shortage of founders and entrepreneurs who move away from their original vision. This is something that I think is much more sort of subjective. And when I work with founders, I will talk with them about, are they really doing something they believe in? And then is this something that can actually be accomplished quickly? What we're trying to do is we're just trying to ask the questions to avoid getting too far down the path where it seems like we can no longer stop, or we've invested a lot of time or a lot of money. I, for example, was involved in helping start a company. We spent about 6 months with no pay building this business. And then for reasons that were actually almost entirely out of our control, we couldn't get it launched because we couldn't get access to the intellectual property that we needed. But I never regretted it because I felt like everything about it was what I had wanted to try to do. And the resolution of it felt true to to who I was. Was it disappointing? Yeah. Was it a big opportunity cost to go 6 months without pay? Yeah, absolutely. But this is the nature of entrepreneurship, right? You really shouldn't be getting into entrepreneurship just because you want to make money. That's, entrepreneurs on average make less than career employees. And so this should be something that you feel, good about, something that you feel you want to accomplish. So as we think about, creating a funnel down to a key specific market segment, we should be sort of linking the things we want to accomplish with the way that these segments function. And so the idea being, can we understand certain characteristics about the segments, both in terms of how they function and then the overall size of the segment, and in order to make some, purposeful decisions about where to start. Where we start is going to matter. We're going to have limited resources, limited time, limited money, limited people, and we're not going to get a lot of shots at this, right? We're going to need to have some early successes to grow a business successfully. And so it's often really then helpful to think, from an end user perspective, what task are they trying to accomplish? What benefit do they really gain? We'll talk about value proposition later. Is the need urgent? Are there what are called lead customers, lighthouse users? That is, people who are likely to latch on to a new idea first, and then that draws other people in. Is this a reasonably big market? How valuable are these end users? Is that in terms of, what the organization actually gets from selling to them? Again, is there competition? Are there other partners or components that we're going to need to incorporate into making this a viable opportunity? Now, the odds are that you're never going to find something that is perfect for all of these, right? Like you might go through and say, oh, high, medium, low, and then you sort of figure out where the best opportunity is based off of that. Yes, we really want some primary data, but some things you're probably going to have to guess at. Uh, our key point, though, is we're trying to get to a little bit of granularity. We're trying to avoid highly generic statements. Many times in this course and other courses, I will ask students, well, especially if they bring me one of their own business ideas, and they will say, this is really obviously going to be successful. And I will say, well, who is your target market? And they will say things like college students. And I'll say, well, I get that, right? College students is a nice market, but it's not truly a market segment, right? College students are very diverse across, even the state of Wisconsin, much less, the United States of America, much less globally. And so, here are some examples, that's sort of extracted from the book, talking about trying to be more specific than saying just young women or just saying moms or just college students, right? We're really trying to get to a more specific aspect of what it is that the need that we're ultimately meeting, right? So if you're selling a product that has to do with transportation, then a lot depends on whether your target market actually has a car or not, right? And there's a big difference between college students with cars and college students who are dependent on public transportation and walking. Similarly, if you are selling some kind of technology solution to college students, you're going to find that college students vary based on how much technology they use. Are they Apple users, Android users? What is their disposable income? Is this something where an extra $20 a month is meaningless to them? Or it's actually, for some of them, maybe a decision about how they're going to spend their free time, or whether they're going to, be able to go out with friends to a restaurant or a bar, or even whether they're going to have enough food that week. And so we really want to be careful about sort of generic statements of market segments, and where possible, we want to be really, really specific. So doing primary market research is not straightforward nor easy, broadly speaking. And it's something that often many college students don't have a lot of expertise in. Sometimes they do. Coming out of high school, maybe they've been involved in fundraising or even activities with clubs where they were doing things like bake sales. And in some cases, they actually, without realizing it, have done primary market research. They've chatted with friends, they've chatted with families. They've gone door to door, maybe to raise money for a sports team or something like that. And in a way, those are forms of primary market research. What we're trying to get away from here is purely qualitative research, which is just talking to like 2 or 3 people and asking some very, generous questions. We're trying to move from that to much more quantitative research, where we've got a big N that is a large number that we're using more structured capabilities, whether it's A/B testing or online surveys. And we're validating the hypotheses, right? So very commonly, we want to move from one to the other. Start with qualitative, where we talk to a limited number of people, very open-ended, asking questions. As we're generating our hypotheses, gosh, I spoke to 5 people, and my hypothesis is it sounds like they would buy something that accomplished the following. Then, if you can move to doing an online survey of 100 people like that and asking them much more specific questions or encouraging them to make comparisons between options, now you're really making a lot of progress. So, useful to be aware, two different methodologies. We love to see both in play, and we tend to go from one to the other. The often the biggest challenges in doing this kind of research are the biases that both the researcher, the entrepreneur brings to the table, as well as the biases that the customers may bring to the table. From the researcher's perspective, one of the challenges is that sometimes we only see what we want to see. And so we ask questions that lead to the answers that we are looking for. If you walked up to a random college student and said, "Hey, how's it going? Would you like a Ferrari?" There's a reasonable chance they would say, "Yes, I would like a Ferrari." And so if you're sort of, and I realize it's a little hyperbolic, but you could very easily unintentionally get to the wrong conclusion from that, which is if I open a Ferrari dealer on the college campus, I'm going to win, right? Because everybody wants Ferraris. Um, so that's a problem. We're asking the wrong question, right? If you asked that student a question like, "What form of transportation do you use now?" And they said, "Oh, I use the free bus." You immediately realize it's clearly not our target customer. Opening the Ferrari dealership on campus probably not going to work. Another challenge is selection bias, sometimes even self-selection bias. Either the people we choose to talk to or the people who sort of self-select into our process doesn't match the segment that we're actually trying to get to. That's a little more complicated. The Ferrari example, quite relevant there. We probably shouldn't just, if we were really serious about the Ferrari dealership, we probably shouldn't have been talking to college students in the first place. But this is why it's so important to really carefully think about that segment in advance, because if you go out and do research from people who aren't in your segment, then your data is meaningless. Finally, there's a bias called social acceptability or social desirability bias, is actually more often the correct term from the psychology research, which is that people want to be liked. We all want to be liked. And so when you interview someone, whether it's a friend or a family member, that person is thinking, oh, they're not thinking it consciously, but in the back of their mind, they still want you to like them. And there's a chance that because of that, they won't tell you the complete truth. You'll ask them a question and they will tell you the answer that they think you want to hear. And the amazing thing is that this comes into play not just with family and friends, but with almost anyone that we talk to when we're trying to do research. This is one of the reasons that many of us in the entrepreneurship space are very suspicious of focus groups. The idea of focus groups for market research has been around for a really, really long time. And there are companies that do them exclusively and so on. And I'm sure they do an excellent job with it. But those kinds of things you have to be really, really careful about, because when you go in and you start asking people, especially in a group context, some of the things about, your idea, your opportunity, this concept of social desirability bias can cause people with the best of intentions to say not what they truly believe deep down, but what they think you want to hear. And in those situations, the data you get is probably not going to be the best data. So in this process where you're doing, primary research, you're in inquiry mode, right? You're open-minded, you're curious. And so you shouldn't be out there pitching your idea or your solution. You shouldn't be going to potential customers and saying, "I've got this amazing thing and I'm sure you'd really like it. Let me tell you about it." And then you get to the end of it and then you say something like, "Do you think you would like that?" We're right back in the Ferrari question. And the odds are good. They're going to say, "Sure, yeah, I would like that," right? It's rather than ask people what they say they feel or believe about the future, what we really would like to do is ask them what their behavior has been in the past, right? How do you do this currently? How much pain or is involved in that? What's your biggest problem that you'd like solved? And what we're shooting for here is to find out what they actually do. Um, and this is something that's been addressed in the psychology research for years and years and years and years. One of the examples I once read about was if you stand in front of a grocery store and as people come in, you say to them, "Oh, are you going to buy bread?" Many of them will say yes. And you say, "Oh, well, tell me how you're going to choose which bread you buy." And they will walk you through this set of characteristics or choices or heuristics or whatever it is they're going to use. And you say, "Thank you." And then, you let them go. Um, if you have someone hidden in the store in the bread aisle watching them when that person comes to actually choose bread, the way they choose bread is not what they told you, right? And it's not that they were liars. It's just that all of these biases come into play and they don't actually effectively predict their own behavior for lots of different reasons. And so what we really want is to know what people do, not what they claim they do or have done or will do in the future. What we'd really like is what have they actually done in the past? What have they bought? Why did they buy it? What were the problems? What's their current context? Once you get through all of that, it's okay to then begin maybe probing towards, future decisions. But asking people about future decisions is dramatically less predictive than finding out the way they've actually behaved in the past. And so there's all sorts of great resources out there about how to do market research. There's a wonderful free online book called Talking to Humans, which you can download for free. And it basically provides a lot of this context around how to do this kind of research. Um, but the bottom line is that we really want to be careful about how we approach these conversations, because if we get the wrong data, it's going to lead us in the wrong direction. The idea behind having a market segment analysis is because eventually we really need to pick one, right? Yes, we may be thinking about a great big large market out there eventually, and maybe we'll get to that. But the more diffuse our effort at the beginning, the less likely we are to get some real wins early on. And so the idea of having a beachhead market, and it's a war analogy, and it is what it is. But the idea behind it is that you're going to start in one spot. This is the place where we get our start, we do our groundwork, and we attempt to capture some ground, right? Capture some actual customers. And the idea being that if we can get this one, then from there, with this bowling alley analogy, that pin can then help knock down pins further on. One of the reasons for this is because if we're too diffuse and we only have bits and pieces of success in different locations, we're not going to know where to focus our efforts. And there's a reasonable chance we won't have even those bits and pieces of success. Our goal here is if we can win significantly in one place, it sets us up to win again somewhere else, even though we may have to do slightly different things. If, for example, you're also going after private capital, raising money from other people or organizations, having some early traction will make a big difference. So the goal around this is to really try to segment down. And the book talks about some examples, going from, for example, some really broad definitions of customers like industrial designers towards something more specific, people who work it with models, and then very specifically people who work with models who are in industrial design who may be toy designers, right? And maybe we would even want to get more specific than that because there are lots of different types of toys, different modes that these, toy makers operate in. But this is the idea behind this, right? And the book talks about kind of being ruthless about this. And that's because for most entrepreneurs, there's some emotional things caught up in how they're choosing which products and services they want to offer and which markets they want to serve. I personally, in my own experience, think that there is some value, as I said, in retaining some of that emotional connection and passion, but you don't do yourself any favors by going after a market segment that's going to be really, really hard to serve and maybe is really, really small. If you want to do that, go for it. Recognize the degree of difficulty. There are no awards for degree of difficulty in business or in entrepreneurship. No one stands up and says, wow, that was really hard, and therefore you get a bonus, right? It doesn't work that way, right? Either the business makes money or it doesn't make money. So the sort of this last piece that we do like to see is generating a total addressable market analysis. And it's actually pretty straightforward. It's really just the number of users or purchases that would be made, or number of users times how much they buy per year, right? And so, for example, if you're selling pizza in Madison and you know that there are 100,000 people in Madison who buy pizza and they spend $10 per pizza, and they do that once a month, you can calculate that out, right? So 100,000 people times $10 times 12 pizzas a year. Boom, total addressable market in this context. Now we can talk about sort of this arrangements of total addressable market, service addressable market, and so on and so forth. The book goes into more details about those. It's good to be aware of the distinctions between them. But the most important thing is simply to realize that you can do these calculations. And estimates are fine at this stage. Obviously, if your market research feeds into your TAM analysis, then you're that much further along. But you shouldn't be afraid to do this. And Gen AI can really help you with it if you give it some guardrails. Gen AI can figure out what total addressable market is, but you may have to tell it how you want to calculate it. Remember that we're also specifically going for annualized revenue, and that can have an impact because some products are bought once a year, some products are bought many times a year, like pizza, and some products are not bought once a year, like cars. People don't buy it. Most people don't buy a new car every single year. And so you have to take that into account as you're thinking about your actual calculation. It's a great exercise just to go through and calculate a whole bunch of TAMs just to see what happens. And feel free, to play around. Gen AI can really help you do some of that stuff. Where possible, we really want to do this bottom up. We can start with top down, but we want to go bottom up where we can. Top down analysis is doing things like, oh, there's 300 million people in America and 5% of them buy a new car every single year. So therefore, there's this many new cars and, this, or we could say something like the total the classic top-down analysis is saying something like, well, the total market for cars in the United States is $800 billion, and we just need to capture 1% of that, right? So there's that fallacy again. What we really want is bottom-up analysis, what the book refers to as counting noses. That is, how many actual people and organizations can we specifically identify, if at all possible, by name, and determine how much we think they're likely to spend. Clearly, in some situations, that's much easier than others. If our customer is, for example, we have a product that would be used in for putting new tires, replacing tires on cars. We could identify, if we really went at it, how many service stations there are around the United States that replace tires. Or if we were even more specific, we were only going to sell to the big chains like Discount Tire or Costco that do tire replacement. Now it's even easier. We can easily identify how many stores there are like that. And so the counting noses becomes much more straightforward. Obviously, when it's much more diffuse, we think our customers are, for example, college sophomores. We can get estimates, but we certainly don't know every single one of them by name. But the more accurate those estimates, the more we're counting noses rather than relying on sort of a top-down estimate, the better our data is actually going to be. Where possible, it's nice to do both of these. Clearly, the bottom-up analysis is usually better. And if you do ever go out for fundraising, you will discover that investors really, really like to see that bottom-up analysis. They get very nervous about the top-down numbers when they see it. So ultimately, this is what we're trying to get to. We're trying to be disciplined about this, right? That's even the title of the textbook. Maybe you brainstormed 100 different possible markets for your product or service, right? And maybe we adjusted the product and service based on that a little bit. And we're trying to get down to eliminate 80, 90% of those so that we can just research a limited number of them, maybe 5. Recognizing that we're going to use that bowling alley analogy. We're going to pick a beachhead, that front pin, and we're going to focus on that eventually. Now, the book specifically talks about this idea of a $20 to $100 million TAM. Let's be realistic here. A certain amount of that is simply because of the nature of the author and some of the target customers for the book. The author is from MIT. A lot of the startups out of MIT are technology ventures. And this kind of beachhead market is arguably what's going to be required in order to raise venture capital. That might be relevant for you. Maybe a tech venture is where you're headed. But clearly, this number, while good to be aware of, again, from the textbook perspective and maybe for quizzes, is specific to a certain kind of venture. And clearly, if you want to start a restaurant or you want to start you know, a bicycle business or something like that, then these numbers are maybe not quite as relevant. But I do want you to sort of just be aware of them just because of the context and what the book is sort of trying to talk about. There's certainly nothing wrong if your number is that big or bigger, but there's also not necessarily something wrong if it's smaller, so long as that fits in with what it is you're actually trying to accomplish. So thanks for listening in. This deck is available on the Canvas site. Hopefully, you've got some context around some of the ideas that we're talking about here, and look forward to connecting with you elsewhere in the course.